Please, from now on, just if something is not clear, just stop me and just ask me as many questions as you like, because I really want to make sure that everything is clear. And if you have any doubts, just ask me. So important things to keep in mind just before we go into the nitty-gritty. The aim of this exercise is essentially just what I wanted to do was to put you in the shoes, so to speak, of real policymakers. To give you a chance to try to wrestle with the same problems the real-life policymakers were faced with, and to give you a taste of what policymaking is all about. Also want you to give you a sense of the challenge that they faced, but also more importantly, and I will stress this few times during the next 50 minutes, is really to encourage you to see whether there are different ways of looking at the problem. This leads me to the next point and allows me to come back to the last one. We holding a fictional cabinet meeting and in the simulation, and your policy reviews are all written for a fictional cabinet meeting. We are pretending that the whole question was discussed and debated and deliberated on in a single cabinet meeting. But it's an historical fiction. Cabinet at least discussed the Rhineland crisis 3 times in March 1936. And the terms of reference, what ministers were asked to discuss, are not the same terms of reference that I'm asking you to discuss. And I'll explain why and what I mean by it. One reason, because I'm really creating a fictional situation, one all-important cabinet meeting, is because I really want to engage you. I mean, I can't run 3 lecture sessions with 3 cabinet meetings as the British government did in March. So, of course, there are temporal constraints, but more to the point is really to engage you the best I could on a counterfactual exercise to see what could have happened if we perhaps imagined different solutions, different options, different courses of action. So what I'm asking you to do is really that you don't have to reproduce the thinking of real-life policymakers. Let me be very clear. I'm not asking you to, if you like, regurgitate what Anthony Eden or others may have argued. What I'm interested in you doing is to familiarize yourself with the situation, with the key facts, with the key issues, the key problems, the key dynamics. But then what I want you to do is to offer me your honest advice, which may or may not be in sync with what the real ministers said to the Prime Minister. So you are free to follow your line of thinking. And as I put in the slide, in fact, you must do so. However, in advising the Cabinet, or let me translate it, in writing your review, your analysis needs to take into careful account the political context you're dealing with. So you're bound by the same constraints, same problems the foreign policy makers were faced with. So for those of you advising the Cabinet, and you are the Secretary of war, you have to try in building your recommendation to really draw upon the existing evidence on the state of the British Army, Air Force, and Navy. So you're bound by those facts. But then in advising me, or in writing your review, in making your recommendations, you can suggest a different course of actions if you disagree with real-life policymakers. That's what I'm trying to say. In other words, you're bound by the same factors, diplomatic, economic, strategic, and domestic, but you're free to suggest a different course of action. Let me stop and take questions. Yes, please.
So can you look for past policy decisions that actually were made to inform the advice that you put forward in this brief?
Yes, in fact, I will, thanks for asking, I will provide you with two key archival resources where you can find, one is particularly effective because you can do key searches. So for instance, you can dig out perhaps memoranda or reports to government that were published the year before, unrelated to Rhineland crisis, but you are given, if you were to be the Secretary for War, you would find some basic figures, some basic facts. And also the literature, the secondary literature, will point you in a certain direction. If you're having troubles finding something, just email me and I'll try to be as helpful as possible and trying to point you to the right direction. So just very briefly, here is the key ministers. Of course, cabinet, in real life, there were more ministers who attended these three meetings on the Rhineland in March. But the one I've chosen, are those for, I chose them on the basis of their political significance and on the basis of strategic policy, imperial policy, European policy, and so on and so forth. So here the real life cabinet, Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs Anthony Eden, Chancellor of the Exchequer, essentially the Treasurer in an Australian context, Neville Chamberlain, Secretary of State for the Dominions Affairs, Malcolm MacDonald, and so on and so forth. So there are real-life policymakers, and if you look at the minutes of cabinet discussions, oftentimes their name is stated clearly, so-and-so said so, and the Prime Minister didn't want anyone to identify a particular person by the name when the briefs were written. The name would be expunged. So during the meeting it was said, so you can't clearly identify anyone. Nonetheless, oftentimes you might see the Secretary of Foreign Affairs made this point and so on and so forth. Some of you will be play the role of ambassadors. Let me make one point. In real life, I cannot think of a real cabinet, British cabinet meeting in which ambassadors have been recalled back to the capital and sat in that meeting. Diplomats are recalled back to their country of origin to discuss the situations and advise ministers, or in particular the foreign minister, but I can't think of a situation where they are in real life being invited to attend cabinet. I came up with this solution because I really wanted more roles, as well as because I think the other way of doing it was to ask some of you to record a video, which I would show in class, to reproduce the situation in which ambassadors don't attend cabinet meetings, but still cabinet would want to hear what the ambassadors have to say. So I said, you know what, I can't possibly bother them, some of them with recording a 10 minutes or 5 minutes video and so on and so forth. So maybe next year if you tell me in your teaching evaluations, in my teaching evaluations, if you think it's a worthwhile avenue to pursue, that those of you playing the role of ambassadors should record a video, I'm happy to do it. But the reason why I include these people, these ambassadors, is because they will provide the cabinet with a specific advice on important players. So Sir Eric Phipps was the British ambassador to Berlin. He can tell us, or you who are impersonating Eric Phipps, will tell us about what kind of threat does Hitler pose to us. Of course, I stress again, these are real figures. They did report back to London. You can even find their dispatches. But if you read those dispatches, be mindful of the context, but what I want you to do is really to argue your point. You do not have to replicate the advice provided by any of these ambassadors if you think that their advice was unsound. You might suggest a different course of action. Next point, if you go through, I hope this is not too lengthy and cumbersome. I know it's a 20-page document, or at least 15 without the bibliography. But what I try to provide here is a description, a more detailed description for each role, and what cabinet is, what cabinet does. I'm pretty sure that all of you are super familiar with it, but nonetheless, it's always best to avoid confusion. But nonetheless, the starting point in writing your policy review, and then when we discuss the simulation, when we'll do the simulation, is what I call the decision point. So essentially, this is the question that I'm posing to you as a prime minister. That's what I want you to advise me on. It's in the guide, but nonetheless, let me read it through quite quickly. On the 7th of March, 1936, German troops marched into the militarized zone of the Rhineland. This action is in clear violation of the Article 42, 43, and then also 44, and the Locarno Treaty. In the light of Germany's grave decision, Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, that is me, has decided to convene an urgent meeting of Cabinet to assess Britain's policy options and to discuss possible action. As Hitler appears determined to stick to his guns, he has been a bit too colloquial, Britain will, among other things, have to weigh whether intervention in the Rhineland is practicable and whether it is worth a potentially dangerous conflict with Germany. So I'm framing your policy reviews as well as the ensuing simulation around these 2 points. Whether intervention is practicable and whether it is worth a potentially dangerous conflict with Germany. But to some extent, this is a fiction, because if you go into the actual documents, the Prime Minister never asked his ministers to discuss the possibility of war. So bear in mind that here we're dealing with a fictional, somewhat fictional case. They have slightly modified or significantly modified the terms of reference in that I'm asking my ministers, I'm asking you and my diplomatic representatives to consider whether we should go to war with Germany as well. But that question was never openly asked because actually it was ruled out from minute one, even before the German takeover took place, and British policymakers thinking that at some point Hitler would make this call, cabinet had come to the conclusion that we would do nothing. Any question?
Would it be smart for us then to use these two A and B points to be a framing of the way in which we step through our policy recommendations?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
If you go back to the archival material, and I'll give you some pointers, some websites, bear in mind that the way you have to frame your review is around these 2 points. Forget about anything else. You just have to think that I'm asking you that whether military action in the Rhineland alongside the French is feasible. Are the French willing to do that? If not, what shall we do? And whether it is worth a potentially dangerous war with Germany. So,
sorry, just because it's related to that, how in depth do you want us to go into our assertion of war and measurement of armament and those sorts of things? I mean, are you looking for?
I'm not looking for anything. Just if you were to be the Secretary of War, I'm not looking for any extremely deep and detailed assessment on the military capabilities of Britain in those years. But just something that proves to me, if you want to make the point that we're not prepared, why we're not prepared. So I'm not asking any of you to go. In fact, I directed Andrew in this. But if you're making a point, let's say you're the Secretary of War and you want to argue, look, we can't really risk a war because we are not prepared. We need to understand why you think we're not prepared. And that would require probably a few basic figures.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
So, using that framework to address those 2 points, if we're approaching it from the perspective of an ambassador, is there a specific, should we approach it differently to say how a domestic minister would approach the problem? Like, for example, for the first questions, should we say, can we rely upon country A's support, and would country A's support make it practical to intervene into the Russian?
Yes, you raise a good question, because for an ambassador is slightly different. So, but you could still argue, you could still make the point, if we were to go to war, please consider those risks. So it's a question of framing the language a little bit differently, as well as you simply telling cabinet, well, there are risks. I don't know what role you're playing. Are you playing the role of an ambassador?
Yes, Soviet ambassador. Just
Okay, so thank you. So they can just, you're playing the role of the Soviet, the British ambassador in Moscow. One issue is to tell cabinet what's going to be the attitude of the Soviet Union in the event that you want to intervene in the Rhineland. So in the event the government considers the option feasible. And whether the Soviet Union will give us any support or no support at all, what can we expect from the Soviet Union, and so on and so forth. And whether it's worth a potentially dangerous conflict with Germany. Here you would say to the Prime Minister, to the Cabinet, it's not necessarily saying, well, we should go to war or not avoid war with Germany. You might say, well, in the case of war with Germany, what's the likely attitude of the Soviet Union? But you still you can feel free to advise cabinet that from your point of view, perhaps based on what the Soviet Union is, you may want to discourage or encourage resort to force. You might still tell cabinet that war could be an incredible risk, it should be avoided, or it could be regarded as a potentially feasible risk, and therefore.
So we could sort of briefly touch on our own personal opinion, but mainly focus on how it would affect our relationship with the country that we're in.
Yes, and I'll come to that point just in a minute in more detail, because you probably, how many of you have gone or have seen this guide? So I really encourage you to, all of you have chosen a role, right? I've seen your names. So for each role, there's a role description and issues for consideration. So the role description and issues for consideration really provide you with a mix of questions and expectations about your role, how you have to frame your policy review. Let me, in a second, come to the point. So your policy review is meant to advise cabinet whether the intervention is feasible or not, advisable or not, and why, of course, and what are the risks of action or inaction. So these are the general issues that we'll certainly discuss in the simulation and you will touch upon in your policy review. In writing your policy review, you'll have to stick to your role description and your assigned issues for consideration. So in other words, the role description and the issue for consideration, I'll get to this point in 20 seconds, will inevitably shape your policy review, how you write it. It will provide you with a set of key questions that you have to address, and the way you answer those questions will determine your final policy position on what to do. Do I start making better sense? No, so I better try to be as clear as possible. I'll get to this point. So, for instance, if we take the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, the role description is is in red. Advise cabinet on broad foreign policy considerations. Policies of the great powers, advise cabinet on what to do in light of the likely reactions of by the great powers. So that's the description of your role. Who's doing the foreign secretary? Who's playing that role and writing a review? So in your case, that's your role description. It's your policy brief, if you like, essentially what I want you to consider in your review. And then a list of questions. In fact, if we go through each question, what policy should Britain pursue in light of the policies of great powers, meaning Soviet Union, Italy, and so on and so forth? What kind of risk does Hitler pose to Britain? What can we expect from the great powers if we decide to challenge Germany on the Rhineland issue? Should we appease Germany or should we confront Germany? Again, keep in mind those general broad questions, but then, if you like, that's the roadmap for you to get to those two questions, feasible and advisable. So you might say, no, it's not feasible because we're not getting the support from anyone else, and therefore it's not even advisable. So sorry, Prime Minister, I'm advising you to stay put. Do I start making sense? Let me give you another example. Let's take the Chancellor of the Exchequer, essentially the Treasurer in Australian context. The Chancellor of the Exchequer or the Treasurer hold the government purse, if you like. He has or she has to ascertain what would be the cost financially of military action against Germany. If you indeed, so for instance, Chancellor of the Exchequer advised Cabinet on Britain's domestic economic situation, advised Cabinet on what to do in the light of the current and likely economic situation in Britain. And then the possible question that you may want to address all of them or most of them. How would conflict in Europe impact on the British economy? Can Britain afford to challenge Germany and risk war? What the current economic situation allow us to deal with Germany? And what would the financial cost would look like in the event of war with Germany? So here again, you still will come in your recommendation, you'll have to essentially, is it feasible from an economic point of view sending forces, British forces to the Rhineland? Is it advisable? Do you get me here?
Yeah.
Please, if something is not clear, so without going through each possible example, for each role that you've chosen, there's a role description with a set of questions. You don't have necessarily to address every single question, but I thought quite carefully about them, so you're most likely to address most of them, because in any case will allow you to get to the final conclusion whether action is advisable, or rather, first is feasible and then advisable. Any other question? So if we were to take, let me give you one last example. The Secretary of State for the colonies. This is a situation that is taking place in Europe. You might think, well, why bothering about the colonies? What the issues are, what the problems are, why are we taking them into the picture? And I guess, again, here, the role description and the key issues for consideration provide you a possible rationale why we should really also take into account the impact of military action in the Rhineland on the British Empire. So the role description of the Secretary of State for the colonies, or the colonial secretary, is advise Cabinet on the general situation in Britain's colonial empire, the implication for Britain's colonial empire if war breaks out with Germany. And here you have a list of questions. The third one is the key one for you. It's the giveaway question, if you're taking up this role. If Britain went to war with Germany, could we expect nationalist, anti-imperialist turmoil to emerge within the British colonial empire? Let me translate it in clearer terms. If we were to go to war with Germany and be bogged down in a European war, what chances are there the anti-colonialist, local anti-colonialist movement, pro-independence movement, will gain momentum, will gain ascendancy, will come out openly and start challenging British rule in the colonial empire? Coming to the role of the ambassadors. I don't know your name. Dylan. Here again, there's a description for, it's the same for all the 5 ambassadors. Let's start and let's just focus on the first one, the ambassador to Germany. Your role is to advise cabinet on Nazi Germany's politics and foreign policy. The questions are, the key questions that you may want to address in full or just most of them. What are the goals? What are Germany's goals in occupying the Rhineland? What can we expect from Germany? That's already a more difficult question. How is Germany going to react if we intervene in the Rhineland? What are the risks of confronting Germany? Can Germany be appeased by offering concessions? You again, by answering these questions, you will come to a conclusion whether intervening in the Rhineland is either feasible and advisable, or it's feasible but not advisable, it's not feasible and it's not advisable. Do you get me? So it's really by, if you start thinking through all these questions, or most of them, you'll come to a conclusion that you think, okay, now it's clear to me what to advise cabinet on the basis of how you're answering those questions. You may end up recommending cabinet, yes, it's feasible, but it's not advisable. Yes, it's feasible and it's advisable that we should do it, and you advise what kind of action. And we might say, no, it's not feasible and it's not advisable. And all we are interested in is just your accuracy in doing research. That we get a sense that you did a good amount of research, that you're familiar with the broad issues, so you know what you're talking about. But we're also very interested in your reasoning. So again, you don't have to take the exact position that was taken by British policymakers, or the same advice that was provided by ambassadors to the British government, in this case, mostly to the Foreign Office. And so we're really interested in if you decide, we won't judge you. Let me tell you, because I'm really interested in the way that you think about this issue. If some of you, after a careful analysis, tells me, no, it's not advisable, nor feasible, and it's all logically argued, and it's well researched, that's our distinction, regardless whether I think, oh, I don't necessarily agree. But if it's not here, it's not the point of me agreeing with the advice that you're providing to cabinet, because then we need to have a discussion here. So on that issue, I'm agnostic. If you tell me that it's not feasible and nor advisable, or if it's feasible and advisable, so it's not feasible nor it's advisable, I'm fine with it. What I'll be looking at is the way that you argue and you support your recommendations. But the recommendation as such, I make no judgment. We've got 5 minutes. I think I should be able. Here, I forgot, I don't know your name. You were asking about the policy review structure.
Yes, I was.
So here for you, a template. So on top, I will upload it on Moodle. Please, on top, tell me what's your institutional role, so that Andrew, as soon as he sees your paper, knows what you'll be doing. So please, if you, for instance, if you are the Foreign Secretary, on top, Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, top secret, memorandum for cabinet. The date of choice is the 9th of March. So this fictional meeting is taking place on the 9th of March, 1936. There'll be a brief introduction, analysis and options, and then recommendation and justifications. If there's any doubt, please just email me. Final point, policy reviews in real life don't have a bibliography and don't have references. In fact, if your ministers see bibliographies and references, they will get terribly upset with you. If you ever go into get a career in DFAT, in foreign affairs, no one will ask you to include the bibliography and list of references, of footnotes and notes. But here we are at UNSW, and therefore it's still an academic scholarly exercise. So facts, figures, needs to be where you get information from, needs to be included. Finally, and then I'm finishing on time, surprisingly, by the way I was going. Sources. Source one, you probably noticed in Leganto, I created an inbox with a number of useful readings on the Rhineland crisis. So for instance, this morning I've forgotten about a very good article written in the 70s in the Australian Journal of Political Science, which is on British policy in the Rhineland. So there you find all the secondary literature on the Rhineland crisis, the issue of appeasement. Some would be more targeted. In some books there'd be more material. In others there'd be a brief overview, but then you'll have the entire context of the mid-30s. In the inbox, I also created a link, in any case you have it here, to access ProQuest. ProQuest has got the entire collection of the British document on overseas policy. You could say on British documents on foreign policy. So in there you'll find a number of declassified British government material on the Rhineland crisis. For instance, reports from Berlin, cabinet memoranda, cabinet decisions, memos between policymakers. So some of you will find more material than others. Here, the advantage of this website is that you can do a search by date, by keywords, and so on and so forth. If you want to use primary sources, top declassified, top secret documents, the way in which real-life policymakers discuss that issue, if you want to have a term of reference, you'll find, if you were to find, for instance, looking for some information, you have to dig for it, but you'll find it. The other website I should point out to you is the cabinet papers from the National Archives of the United Kingdom. Here again, here you'll find actually, just to give an example, these were the minutes of the cabinet meeting of 9 March 1936. So you've got the list of